Inyan Chanukah. What is Chanukah about?
It's a very interesting question. Where's this?
So this mimer is really special. It's in Torah Or, of course. Lamed Bet Bet. And it's special because it was said in between the prison, the arrests of the Alter Rebbe. It was said in Tavkuf Samech.
This was the second arrest?
Between the first and the second.
The
Second one was in Tavkuf Samech Aleph.
First arrest he arrived.
Tavkuf Nun Tet.
On the first day of Hanukkah. Second arrest
They finished in Chanukah. Fifth day of Chanukah. But then
in between?
Just 1 year.
That's all?
Little less than a year. But this is very interesting. This is from the time between. Remember, we talked about this time. Very interesting time.
Why is he talking about Hanukkah?
And it appears... What?
So it wasn't Hanukkah when he said it?
It was Hanukkah. It was Lamed Kislev. It was the 5th day of Hanukkah.
The day he came out of prison the second time?
No, this is a year before. I said it's between the two prison
So
sentences.
immediately after he came out of prison the first time?
It's not immediately after. It's a year after. There was 2 years between them. And this is exactly in the middle between the two sentences. No, 2 years.
Okay.
So this is interesting because this is when I said that on the one hand he had already changed his mind, that he was going to have a new shlichus in the world, which was to explain and elaborate on the Baal Shem Tov and Maggid's Torah. But he hadn't started yet. So this is a mid-length mimer. It's not very long. We've seen longer from the time before the first imprisonment. But we'll see if there's a change in the style here. So this he said in Lozhna. This also appears as a version of this mimer. This was written probably by the Maharil, by his brother. But in Etalich Lozhna, which is the maimarim that we have from Lozhna, it's just a name they gave to it. It's not really...
When did he move to the other?
After the second imprisonment, 6 months after he was released, in the summer of 1801. So, in Talich Lozhna, there's another version of this Maimer that was written by the Alter Rebbe, by his son. Hinei kavu anes banerot. The miracle in Chanukah was applied or fixed on candles. Masha enkem bishar anesim. We see that usually the way that the miracle was fixed to be remembered was by something that you eat. Okay. So he says, for instance, bePesach, b'Yetziat Mitzrayim tuchlu matzot. You eat matzah.
Okay.
bePurim, yemei mishteh v'simcha.
What about the nest of sukkahs? They lived in the sukkah in the wilderness. It was fixed on the sukkah, which is not something you eat.
In any case, it was done on something that was edible. כנגד הגלות שהיה גם כן גופני. So in Mitzrayim, because the galus there, the exile, the thing that we faced was also physical, right? Now we begin to understand why. So even if you say sukkos, so we build a sukkah that's physical.
Well, the candles are also physical.
No, the candle is the light. We're not talking about the physical candle. We're not interested in that. We're interested in the flame. Anyway, you see the difference between a sukkah and a candle, right?
Candle can burn down.
I mean, what sort of derails your thinking here is that we always light candles at the beginning of a holiday. So you think there's also candles here, but that's an afterthought. That's from Chazal. That's from the sages. You say all of Chanukah is from the sages. So it's also true, and Purim is also from the sages. But there's no candles on Purim. Okay? There's no such thing. B'Mitzrayim, b'chomer v'levinim. In Egypt, obviously, they were enslaved to work with how do you say chomer? With mortar and bricks. Uvimei Haman, and in the time of Haman, In Purim, bikesh lashmidu shalalam lavoz. He wanted to destroy them physically. מה שאין גם בחנוכה, שהיו ישראל שרויים על אדמתם ולא גלו מארצם, רק גלות התורה להשכיחם תורתך ולהעבירם חוקי רצונך. But in Chanukah, the whole affair was in Eretz Yisrael. There was no exile at the time, as it were. They weren't away from Eretz Yisrael. It was just the exile of Torah. Because what the Greeks wanted to do was to make us forget the Torah, to prevent us from keeping its rules. Lefichach kavu banerot. Therefore, they chose candles. Hashem HaPasuk, based on the verse, Ki ner mitzvah v'Torah Or, v'derech haim tochochot musar. The verse in Proverbs reads that a mitzvah is a candle and Torah is light. And the path of life is based on musar, on morality, on having critical morality. In any case, so you see that that light and candles, they are related to mitzvos and Torah. ולהבין עניין פסוק זה, and to understand this verse, וגם ספר דקרא דכתיב ודרך חיים, and also to understand the end of the verse, that a way of life is based on critical morality, צריך ביאור איזה דרך חיים הוא מלבד התורה והמצוות האמורה למעלה. We have to understand what path of life could he possibly be talking about that would be different than Torah and mitzvos. What else is a path of life? What else is a way of life? Again, lifestyle. What other lifestyle is there? The only lifestyle Torah would be talking about would be Torah and mitzvos. והעניין, כי מה שהמשיל המצווה לנר והתורה לאור הוא מובן. So to understand this, we first have to look at the connection between a candle and a mitzvah, and Torah and light. And that's understandable. Why? שכמו שהנר נקרא על שם השמן. The ner, the candle, is named after, meaning the crux of the candle, the core of the candle is not the wick, it's the oil. Lishon Razal ner shel shemen. This is how the sages always refer to it, as a candle of oil. Ner shel she'ava, a candle of wax.
Wax candle.
Hinei aval pi she'shemen en bo or mitzad hasmo. Even though the oil itself or the wax or whatever burning material you have does not contain the light in and of itself. ואדרבה הוא מכבה את האור הנופל לתוכו. And on the contrary, it usually extinguishes any flame that will just fall into it. כן. מכל מקום, ממנו ועל ידו נמשך לאו שלבת האור נאחז בפתילה. Nonetheless, from it, and thanks to it, the flame connects to the wick. במעט שמן הנמשך אחר בפתילה, with a little bit of oil that's drawn into the wick. שהרי בכלות השמן נכבה האור, because when we see that when the oil runs out, the flame is extinguished.
No, I think we've learned this one, yeah?
We might have. ככה ממש היא המצווה. So too is a mitzvah. הגם שהוא רצון המלך, בלי שום טעם ודעת, ואין בו שום השגה. Even though the mitzvah, to put tefillin on, to build a sukkah and live in it, all the things that we do, they're what Hashem wants. And as far as we're concerned, since Hashem is above us, unfathomable, we can't understand the reason. And b'shum hasaga, we can't fathom what this is all about. Mikol makom, nonetheless, mimena v'al yada nimshach v'nitgala or chokhmah zu Torah she'ba'al peh. It's thanks to the mitzvos that the light of wisdom, which is the oral tradition, was drawn down into the world. Deoraita michokhmah nafakt, because it says that Torah came out of wisdom. Which Torah are we talking about? The Torah, the oral tradition. והחוכמה וההבנה בתורה שבעל פה הוא רק להבין ולהשיג פירוש וטעם המצוות. כל מסכת לפי עניינה. So the Torah itself came out of wisdom. And what?
Hashem's wisdom.
כן, Hashem's wisdom, which is unfathomable. והחוכמה והבנה בתורה שבעל פה, and the ability to understand and to fathom, if you want, the oral tradition, the Torah Shebaal Peh, is based on the performance of mitzvos. Meaning that's what gives it to you. So it's a very interesting idea. And if we learned this, I don't remember that we learned it. What is he saying? He's saying that if there were no mitzvos, it would be impossible to continue to develop the Torah with the oral tradition. Meaning the Torah would remain as it was, but it's the mitzvos that we do, the commandments that we do, that allow us to draw down more light to be able to create the oral tradition.
Well, the reason why we have the Torah is the mitzvahs.
Seder, but he's saying the mitzvahs provide the oil. Okay? They're the candle that allows the mind to properly understand the Torah in order to develop the oral tradition. So how does this work? So that's a general statement. And what this means in service of God. So the verse in Tetzaveh says that in the morning, early in the morning, he will better the candles. Because the Kohen comes in the morning, after most of the work has been done, of the Korban Atamid and all that. And he comes in to check on the status of the Menorah. And whatever candles didn't last until now, they are bettered, meaning that their wicks are replaced and the oil is filled back up, but they're not lit. We may have learned this because I also had that question then. Are they lit or not? So they're not lit because they're lit only in the afternoon. So they're prepared for the lighting, but they're not lit yet in the morning. And then in the afternoon, when Aaron, it says raises the candles, but really what it means is he lights the candles in the afternoon, yaktirena. Here we have, like when you put incense on the altar, what's that called? Ktoret. Right? That ktir is to put something on the altar, meaning it's to consecrate something. So in the afternoon, when he lights the candle, he consecrates. And by the word consecrates, we understand that the candles that were still lit in the morning, now when he comes in the afternoon, they've either extinguished already, or if they're still burning, he puts them out and he fixes those candles. So before he lights everything, he has to fix all the candles. They're all ready to be lit. They all have new oil, a new wick, and so on. And then he lights them. So he says we have to understand, why is it that in the morning this process of changing the wick and the oil is called bettering the menorah, and in the afternoon it's called consecrating it.
Because we're now about to light them, so it's a different issue.
Okay, let's see. Hinei Knesset Yisrael Mekol Nishmot Yisrael Nikret B'Shem Menorah. So the menorah itself symbolizes the congregation of Israel, the source of all the souls of Israel. V'hi miksha, and it's described there in Tetzaveh as, in Ba'aloscha, this is described, that it's one solid piece of metal, of gold. So the congregation of Israel is also one solid piece, meaning all the Jewish souls are one together in their source. And then from the body of the menorah come out the arches, the branches, right? And each branch has a candle on top. Because in general, instead the general thought is the congregation of Israel, but more particularly, there are 600,000 separate sparks of souls. And each one of these sparks itself divides into 600,000 sparks. So there's two levels of sparks. So we have three levels here. The solid one-piece congregation of Israel, 600,000 general sparks, and 600,000 particular sparks that comes out of each spark. And all this is explained in the Tanya in chapter 37. And we saw this actually last week, I think, that in principle, in general, all these sparks were contained in the 70 souls of Yaakov's house that went down to Egypt. And and instead of 70, we call it 7 candles. Yeah, so in general, we call them 7, but really it represents all 600,000 sparks. Aaron, who lights the menorah, he's called he's the chaperone of the princess. He's the priest. He's the priest of the God Most High, and he's one of the 7. Right, we learned this because we had this question about how is Aaron one of the 7 shepherds. He's not one of the 7 shepherds. We know who the 7 shepherds are, right? 7 shepherds. He's one of the Ushpizim, but he's not one of the 7 shepherds. So we saw that there was a letter from the Rebbe that said that whenever you say Moshe, you also have Aaron in there.
They're like the same person.
Right. Because the shepherds are what's it's interesting that they don't have a they don't have the source in Sukkah here, in Sukkah Nun Beis. But he has they wrote a long note here. Let's read it quickly. Yeah, he says that's what he starts with. He starts with that question. You see it on 86. We've seen the same letter that we looked at last time. לשאלתו המקור למה שכתוב כאן בתורה אור ולקוטי תורה ועלותך דארון ומשבעה רואים בסוכה לא נזכר. So he said that in Sukkah in Daf Nun Beis it doesn't mention Aaron among the 7 shepherds. כן, נזכר לעיל ובעוד מקומות בתורה אור כמצוין במפתח. But he says there's also many places in Torah Or that he mentions that Aaron is one of the 7 shepherds. So how do we understand this? המקור הזה יש לומר בשניים. So the source to say that Aaron is one of the 7 shepherds, there's 2 sources for this. The first one he says in Zohar Chadash. Right? Zohar Chadash, I think I told you once, is what was left over when they printed the Zohar the first time in Cremona and in the other place. What was it called? I forget now the other Italian name. No. Because I'm thinking in English, I can't remember the name of the place in Hebrew. Can't remember right now. So when they were printing it, they went over the Zohar, and the printer decided, he had some chachamim there, he had some wise scholars, and they decided what to include and what not to include. And the reason that they decided certain things not to include was either because it was unclear what it said, what the handwriting said, and they couldn't decipher it, or they actually decided that it wasn't frum enough. There was some problem with it. And so they didn't print it. Later, about, I think 200 years later, somebody came along and went over it again and decided, I don't remember who the scholars were this time, I don't know if anybody knows, but we're talking about sometime in the 1700s, people came along, scholars came along and said, no, there was a mistake not to print these pieces. These pieces are just as important and they're fine. There's nothing wrong with them, because it took time to understand. It took time for the Chachamim to understand of the 1600s and the 1500s to understand the language of the Zohar and to understand what he wanted and the style. So at first they thought maybe this is some kind of extraneous material that found its way into the manuscript. But after 200 years, after knowing the Zohar well enough, it was decided that this is fine, this material is fine. And so it was reprinted. All the hashmatot, basically, all the things that were left out, were reprinted in the Zohar Chadash. And there, at the end, it says, Kam Raya Mehemna l'Ragloi v'Amar. So, Raya Mehemna, Moshe Rabbeinu, the faithful shepherd, stood on his feet and said, Rayan Kadishin, holy shepherds. Who are the holy shepherds? Avram, Yitzchak, v'Yakov, v'Adam Kadama, v'Aaron, v'David u'Shlomo. So Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Adam. So far it's somewhat similar. Yitzchak, I think, is not in Sukkah. It's Avram, it's Adam, Sheis, Enosh, and I think Yaakov is in the middle there. And then Aaron, David, and Shlomo on the right side or on the left side. ועל פי זה מתורץ גם כן בתורה עוד אברהם הוא הרועה הראשון ובסוכה האדם הראשון. So it also explains why in Sukkah, in the source in the Talmud, it says that the first shepherd was Avram, and in the Zohar Chadash, the first shepherd is Adam. And in Torah Or, he quoted that the first shepherd was Adam. So that's like the Zohar Chadash. And second, B'Torah Or, mashma degam Yitzchak bichlal haroim. As like we said, the Yitzchak is not in the list of the shepherds in Sukkah, but he is in the list of the shepherds in the Zohar Chadash. So that's the first source. There's a source in Zohar Chadash, in the leftovers from the Zohar. You gotta admit, it's nicer to call it Zohar Chadash than to call it Ashmatot HaZohar, the leftovers of the Zohar. They chose a very nice name, Zohar Chadash, new Zohar. But what they really meant was that these were things that were not printed the first time. Second, Bezohar Chelek Bet, in the second part of the Zohar, Hu Aaron u'Moshe lachlala dabeda, that whenever you say he is in the singular Moshe and Aaron, we learn from that whenever you say Moshe, you also mean Aaron, and evidently whenever you say Aaron, there's also an aspect of Moshe there, right? Even though in the Medrash, I think we talked about this last time also, in the Medrash there's such a thing that there were 13 nevuos, 13 prophecies that only Aaron heard and Moshe didn't hear, and those 13 are in the Torah. Okay. I'm skipping. But there's another kasha that you can say here, another question. בתורה אור וליקוטי תורה מפרש עניין השבעה רואים שמשפיעים על לקוטו לכנסת ישראל, ואינו מובן כלל מה העניין שת ומתושלח בזה. Why is it that in the Talmud, in Sukkah, we have that among the 7 shepherds are Seth and Methuselah? How did they get into this business? They're not shepherds of faith. They were holy people in their time, but they're before the Jewish people. Adam made it, we understand, maybe to some extent. But Seth and Methuselah, how did they get into it? והנה הצמר צדק על הפסוק במיכה מדייק לשני פירושים בתיבת והקימונו. The whole idea of 7 shepherds comes from a pasuk in Micha. והקימונו לנו 7 רועים ו8 נסיכי אדם. That we will place above us 7 shepherds and 8 princes of man. Okay? So the Tzemach Tzedek says about this word to place above us, hakimonu, like will raise above us. Alashu. First of all, that there it says, Vakimonu lanu, Shiva roim u'shmona nesichei adam. It's all talking about facing Assyria, facing the empire that was growing to the north. It was the way to deal with the challenge of Assyria, right? Because we have this interesting thing that when the Jewish people came out of Egypt, there were 600 years of quiet in the land of Israel. Historically. Hashem does a favor for us. Tremendous favor. He brought us out of Egypt. That was the end of Egypt. Egypt never recovered. So historians will tell you Egypt was falling apart anyway. The empire that we were enslaved by was falling apart anyway. Whether we left or not didn't make any difference. The Torah wants to say they never recovered from what happened at the Red Sea. That's why they never talked about it. It was impossible for them to talk about it because there was no one left. The empire disintegrated after a few years after this all happened. So there was nobody to take an account, a historical account, and to preserve it even. So I think that historically, if I understand correctly the history, there's no way that you would ever find anybody documenting how it is that we fell apart. Right? The Romans never documented how they fell apart. No great empire, the Babylonians, no emperor documents the fall apart. You have to have such a tremendous responsibility to mankind to document your own falling apart. Right? It's after the fact people try to understand what happened. But as it's happening, and usually you'll get a very, I think, biased account in the end that serves the person who's writing the history. So the Egyptian empire fell apart. In the east, the great empires had not been developed yet. There was no Babylon. There was no Assyria. They didn't exist. Certainly no Persia, and nothing of that. To the west, the Greeks had not started yet. So you have this incredible time in the history of the world that everything has fallen apart. Now, this is a big deal in the archaeological world. I don't remember what they call it. They call it the late Bronze Age something or something. I don't remember what they call it. They have a name for it. And it lasted for about 500 years. The fall of Troy is connected to it, by the way. Everything in the world disintegrated. And that's the time...
What were the Jewish people doing then?
They were building. Now, they didn't have an empire. You understand that they didn't have an empire? No, this is before. This is about the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim.
We said 800 years.
600 years of quiet.
Okay, so therefore they already go to the base of English.
It lasted until about the year 600 BCE. So we're talking about from about 1200 to 600
When was the
BC.
base of English put up?
The year 800 BC. 900, 800, 900. So they had 4, 5, 6 centuries of quiet from everywhere around them. Hashem didn't take us out of Egypt and said, here, build an empire or build anything in bad circumstances, in difficult circumstances. He made them in very easy circumstances. There was no great power anywhere that could stop us from doing what we needed to do. And then you see that we wasted 400 years on nothing. You know, instead of going into Canaan and being unified and making a king. In fact, originally it was supposed to be Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Okay, that didn't work out. But then Yeshua could have done everything. But instead they came in and they took over whatever they took over that was easy. They didn't fight anything. They didn't really try to, Jews don't really fight. What they do is they convince their neighbors that our religion is a lot better. Stop with your mishagas. Come join us. They could have easily converted everybody. They didn't have to kill them. That was the other option. You can convert them. And I'm sure that that's what they wanted. They didn't do any of this. It slowly trickled in both directions. They were affected by the Canaanites. Some of the Canaanites were affected by them. There was no clear decision. This has to be a land that follows the Torah. They never did that. They never unified into one coherent whole, and they never enforced in the sense of educating. They never enforced the education of the Torah on the population. It started in the time of Shaul and David. So that's when they began to understand. When did they begin to understand? Something happened. Exactly what happened is hard to say. But they saw that the nations around them had a king that was more than just a tribal king. Because this was the beginning of the awakening of the nations around them. It's a very interesting thing. That they didn't want a king that would unify the entire people until they saw that happening to the tribes around them. When they saw that the other tribes are unifying, they began to think, wait a minute, we need a melech kechol hagoyim. We need a king like all. It's like what the Torah predicted this, because it says that when you come into the land of Israel and you say, "I want to make myself a king like all the nations around me," what's he saying? He's saying that the king, the Jewish king, is not going to come because of some unification, because you understand the value of it. Rather, you're going to begin to understand the value when the nations around you begin to unify and you're left behind. So you're always playing catch up. And you begin to understand we're not going to survive in this neighborhood if we don't unify. It's very... And then 200 years later, the Assyrians were already in business. They were already, top dog in the neighborhood. They were a great empire. And so there was nothing that could be done anymore. That they had split into 2 kingdoms already. They weren't as strong as they were. They had fought against each other. And now the Assyrians are very, very powerful. And so they took over the northern kingdom very easily. But if they had to take over both the southern and northern kingdoms together, if they had been unified, they probably would have been saved. So you see that the whole story historically is Hashem provides a window of opportunity for you to do everything you need. And they didn't do it. And then later they begin to play catch up. And they're always late to the game. And everybody thinks the Jews rule the world. It's really, really ridiculous. The Jews are always playing catch up. They don't get it. Okay, but it was too late already. It was 400 years too late. You had 400 years to do all this. And, most importantly, after 26 years of having the temple in Yerushalayim, they split into two nations. They split into the northern and southern kingdom. 26 years. It took him 14 years to build the temple, and he reigned for 40 years. And when his son took over, they immediately rebelled against him. And they split it. So it was only 26 years, Havaya years, of the temple in Yerushalayim being the unifying focus of the entire people. It's a ridiculous history when you think about it. What is going on here? So he says here also this whole notion of 7 shepherds of faith and 8 princes of man is all in response to Assyria. So we'll see the rest of it, I guess, tomorrow.
I have a question for you. The Kohen used to eat from the kavanas, right?
Hopefully.
And the people who brought kavanas, some of it was eat. Okay? When they shifted a cow or a sheep, it was raw.
You cooked it. What do you mean?
Yeah, where did they cook it?
In the Beis Mikdash, where there was the whole place. There were the shakot where they cooked.
Because we didn't put it on the mizbeach.
No, of course not. You didn't eat from the mizbeach. You're not allowed to.
Right. So where did
they cooked, and it was all cooked. It wasn't done as on the. That's one of the big mistakes that people have. They think it was a bistro. That you eat like shawarma, like it's on the fire.
Yeah.
It wasn't done on the fire. It had to be cooked.
Which means?
It was like in water. It was like a stew. It wasn't. Also, when you think about it, if they would have been eating all the time meat that's from a fire, they would be so sick.
No, they were sick.
No, they weren't so sick because it was a stew.
Barefoot, so they got colds.
Yeah, but it was a stew. The stew is much easier. It's cooked a long time.
They didn't put anything with it. They didn't
of course they did. They put a lot of vegetables with it.
Yeah.
They ate a lot of vegetables with the stew. I don't remember I think that once you get the meat, you can mix it with vegetables in the stew itself. I believe that's the halacha.
You have the recipe.
You should. It's your department.